Hey y'all, welcome back to another buyer's guide slash item review where we talk about just the usefulness of OSRS items and how good they are for their price point, when we think a player should get them, where they're useful at, etc., etc. Today we're going to be doing a little twofer. I figured it made sense to talk about these two items together because, well, mainly because someone left a comment on one of my other videos saying, I have like both of these weapons, but I'd love to like move the money around basically, and I feel like they felt like it was a lot of money to have sunk into like both of these weapons, and they're curious basically like in terms of like both of these weapons, like which one of these is more useful basically, and which one should I keep, which one should I sell. At least that sounded like what they were getting at to me. So we're going to talk about these two items together for a number of reasons, but just basically, long story short, because they have a ton of similarities and because they're like really well balanced between the two of them. And so it's like it's really, really individual and case by case basis in terms of which of these two items you should get first, which of these two you should prioritize, and which one you can like put off for a long time. It really depends on what content you do because these weapons are so well balanced both in terms of price and in terms of like the locations where they're useful. So let's start by looking at the header. The Voidwaker and the Dragon Claws are both almost identical prices right now. 61 mil for the Voidwaker and 60 mil for the Dragon Claws. These are melee DPS spec weapons, so they both serve a very similar role. I'll say that I'm not going to talk very much about PvP, just because this is kind of a PVM focused series. We do talk about PvP a little bit, and I'll just gloss over it real quick that these are both monster items in PvP. Like, both of these are exceptionally good plus ones, and if you're looking for good spec weapons in PvP, yeah, I mean, they both have like arguments for and against them in terms of like one versus the other, but they're both really, really good. So, anyways, let's go ahead and get into the PVM use cases. So, these are like the main use cases that I could think of for the Dragon Claws and Voidwaker each respectively, and we're going to talk about how these compare, but we're going to start by talking about Cox. So, Dragon Claws, I gave a use case at regular Cox, which a lot of experienced players might think that's kind of questionable. The reason is because if you're doing like regular Cox, unscaled and solo, this is I should have put unscaled reg Cox on here, which is a very common way that people solo Chambers of Xeric, then they're probably going to be scouting out Vasa every raid because it's a really fast room, and they're going to be taking their Dragon Claws to use at crystals. So this is a really minor use case, but at Reg Cox and unscaled solos, you will take your Dragon Claws to speed up Vasa's crystals. So that is a use case I wanted to put for it, but the Voidwaker I would say gets a more significant use case in CM Cox. Because in CM Cox, the Voidwaker just kind of really turns out useful in enough places that we do take it in an in-game CM loadout. We take it for two main reasons. The first one is to use it as a stab weapon at Vasa crystals, so we don't have to use our scythe there, which really isn't ideal. And then the second one is Vanguard. It is your best in slot spec weapon on Vanguard. And you're going to be doing Vanguard because it's a CM, whereas in Reg Cox you would not be doing Vanguard. Like, Voidwaker would be better at Vanguard if it was a Reg Cox, but you don't ever do Vanguard in Reg Cox, whether it's scaled or unscaled, so we can't put it as a use case. And then, also, if you don't have a ZCB, you can use the Voidwaker on Vasa itself as a spec weapon. That's one other use case that I should mention, but if you do have a ZCB, it's not as ideal. So now let's get into the main use cases of these two weapons now that we've got Cox out of the way. So we'll start with the Dragon Claws. Dragon Claws are very, very important at Tob. Every role takes Dragon Claws at Tob, and they're just a really important weapon to have there. There's a lot of situations in Tob where burst DPS is very useful, and so getting Dragon Claws earlier than later is a good idea at Tob. Now, Burning Claws do a fairly decent... We're going to try not to make this a Burning Claw video, but I am going to have to bring them up a few times. Burning Claws do a pretty, like, passable job, I would say, substituting for Dragon Claws at Tob, so you can keep that in mind. But yeah, Dragon Claws ultimately, I think, are like, if you're doing a lot of Tob as your main raid, then Dragon Claws are the one you're going to lean towards. The Dragon Claws aren't very useful at TOA. The only real place that you would use Dragon Claws would be on the last phase of Akka, the come phase basically. You could use it to speed that up, but that's like not enough reason to take them. And it's very rare, it's exceedingly rare to see anyone take Dragon Claws into TOA because they're just not good there. Voidwaker, on the other hand, a lot of people take the Voidwaker into like 8-man 400s because it can be used both as a whack weapon on the core. It's like equivalent to a tentacle whip, or a regular whip, I should say, on the core, which is pretty good. And then it's also the best in slot spec weapon on Kefri. So for that reason, people take it into TOA. If you don't have a ZCB, you can also spec Zabak with it. You can also spec Akka with it if you don't have a ZCB. If you do have a ZCB, that's better. But if you don't, then yeah, it's got even more use cases at TOA. So at TOA, until you get up to like 500s, where the Voidwaker just doesn't do enough damage on the core at that point. But like, I would say like 400s, 410s, and lower, Voidwaker's a very good item at TOA. And then Claws are obviously really good at TOB. In terms of Cox, and just to leave the raids on a final note, I would say like these aren't the most important items at Cox. So in terms of picking between those two, you should try to consider mainly, do I prefer TOA or do I prefer TOB? And if you prefer TOB, go for the Claws. If you prefer TOA, go for the Voidwaker. So now let's talk about the other locations where these items are really good. So at Coliseum, you're going to be taking Dragon Claws as your best in slot spec weapon for DPS. So assuming you're doing like efficient Coliseum, you're going to want to take Claws and you're going to want to have Claws. Very notable use case because that's a very good money maker. Vardorvis, also Claws are best in slot, and then also Araxor and Cerberus. These are basically all the best in slot locations that you use Dragon Claws, at least that like are. There's a few I didn't put on here because I was kind of running short on room. Things like a Moxliotl, things like Royal Titans. Dragon Claws are best in slot at a Moxliotl and Royal Titans, but they're just kind of like minor use cases, and I don't want the video to run too long or get too clouded with information, so I kind of just left them to the side, but I guess we'll mention them real quick. And then here at the bottom, I have sub-cases. So you'll notice that Vorkath and Duke are both on the Voidwaker side in terms of use cases, but the sub-cases basically means like if you don't have a Voidwaker, you can use Dragon Claws at those locations, and they're like really good. Like they're a really good substitute for a Voidwaker, basically. That's true at Vorkath, and that's true at Duke, where the Dragon Claws are both about, that's about 6% behind Voidwaker at both of these locations. Depending on your setup, it could be a little bit more. But yeah, so they do substitute viably there, but they're not ideal versus the Voidwaker. So now, Voidwaker is best in slot at Nex. It is your best in slot spec weapon. There is a case for the ZCB as a spec weapon in certain situations, but the Voidwaker, I believe, is still best on Nex. So yeah, and it is taken in in-game loadouts. Voidwaker's best in slot spec at Nex. It is best in slot spec at Nightmare. Because, you know, Nightmare is pretty tanky, and the Voidwaker is guaranteed damage, so you'll notice that any boss that's, like, really tanky ends up on this side, because the Voidwaker ignores defense, and so that's, you know, obviously really good for tanky bosses. The Corporeal Beast, Voidwaker is a monster at Corporeal Beast. It is, like, the booster's best friend there. Bandos, if you are doing melee, if you're like tanking or doing any type of melee DPS on Bandos, then Voidwaker is also your best in slot spec weapon. Probably using a Fang and a Voidwaker. It's a pretty common strategy that people use in small teams. Voidwaker is really, really strong. It's also, Krill kind of falls in the same boat as Bandos. I just didn't put it on here because, again, minor use case, and I'm kind of running short on room. Vorkath, the Voidwaker is your best in slot melee spec weapon. I believe it's best in slot in general. I don't think a ZCB is better, but yeah, assuming you're meleeing the boss, you're not going to want to take a full range switch, and you'll take a Voidwaker. And I think that if you're ranging it, you probably don't want to take a full melee switch, but I think the Voidwaker would technically still be better. And then at Duke, a lot of people prefer to BGS Duke. I do too. BGS is really good as a spec weapon there because he's so tanky and you want to bring his defense down. But if you are going to DPS spec Duke, then Voidwaker is your best option there. And then sub cases, the Voidwaker is about 10% worse than Dragon Claws at Vardorvis, which is good enough that it definitely serves as a viable substitute. That is still better than Burning Claws. They're basically equivalent at the start of the kill, but why would you use Dragon Claws at the start of the kill? You'd use them at the end of the kill when his defense is lower, and at that point in the kill, they're about 10% better. So yeah, that's like the main shakedown. that I can give these two weapons. And you can just, what I would say to you is if you're trying to decide which one of these two you should go for, you should just look at these two lists of use cases and you should ask yourself which one has more content that's important to you. And you should go for that weapon, basically. Dragon Claws don't substitute for Voidwaker very well in very many places because a lot of these bosses just aren't weak to slash. Like Nex isn't weak to slash, Nightmare's not weak to slash, Corpse not weak to slash. All of these places, like, Dragon Claws just aren't going to do you anything. And then the Voidwaker runs into the problem of getting outclassed by Burning Claws at a lot of these bosses. Like Tob, before Burning Claws came out, Voidwaker used to be a pretty dang good substitute for Claws at Tob. If you didn't have Claws, you could take a Voidwaker and it would do like a 7 out of 10 job serving in its stead, I would say. But now it's the Burning Claws on everything except for P2 and Sodetseg are just flatly better than a Voidwaker, and they're like 10 mil. So you probably could get those, and you should take those to Tob instead of a Voidwaker. And also P2 and Sot, that's not worth very much because you want to hammer Sot. And then P2, I guess that's worth a little something, but it's not enough to justify taking the Voidwaker to spec P2 once with it, probably. It's not worth taking. And then Araxor, once again, you're outclassed by Burning Claws over the Voidwaker. Cerberus, you're outclassed by Burning Claws over the Voidwaker. So yeah, that's the main reason you don't see more sub cases for the Voidwaker, even though you might think that there should be, is because the Burning Claws ultimately surpass it at most of these locations. So that is, I know that was a lot of information because there's a lot of places where these two weapons kind of come into a tight comparison. Like I said, they're really well balanced. But that is the long and short of the Voidwaker versus the Dragon Claws as DPS spec weapons. They're both really good weapons, and I would recommend that, once you, I would say that, a lot of people have a hard time figuring out what to do with their money before they get mega rares, and they get stuff like a Masori set when they already own a crystal set, for example. That's mostly useless to you. You should get one of these instead, because these are going to actually make a significant difference for you. I want to finish this off with just a nice little bow by saying, if I was talking to the person who left that comment who wanted to figure out if they could shuffle some money around and potentially sell their Voidwaker or Burning Claws, and I asked them, what type of content do you do? And they told me, well, I like to do pretty much all the content in the game. I would say, okay, that's a fair answer, and I would say what you should do then is you should sell your Dragon Claws, and you should keep your Voidwaker, and you should buy a pair of Burning Claws if you really need to move money around badly. That's what I would say, because the Burning Claws do a really good job substituting for Dragon Claws at pretty much all of the locations that are really important. They're not as good, obviously, but they are a viable substitute. The Burning Claws cannot substitute for a Voidwaker. Burning Claws are flatly awful at pretty much all of the locations over here on this left-hand side. So as a result, keeping your Voidwaker is going to keep these locations covered, and getting Burning Claws to replace your Dragon Claws is going to mostly cover most of these locations. So if you really need to free up the money, that's what I would say. So yeah, that is the breakdown of Dragon Claws versus Voidwaker. I hope it was helpful. I'll see you in the next one.